Well, this video is for 9V, just taking you through the worksheet for today on the cosmological argument. I think this is probably going to take us 2 lessons. So if we consider this to be the work for both Wednesday and Thursday, there's about 7 tasks on this worksheet, and you can fill them in and then just upload them. You can edit them on Microsoft Teams. The first question, we're looking at the arguments for and against the existence of God for this essay on should we believe in God and his existence. And some of the classic arguments for the existence of God come from Thomas Aquinas. He put forward 5 ways, or 5 proofs, as it were, for God's existence, 3 of which are to do with causation. You know, how did the whole cosmos come to be here, hence the cosmological argument. So this goes back at least to Aquinas, if not before, and there's a video here on the worksheet just to listen to, and then you follow down the worksheet here. Leibniz was a mathematician. He didn't like loose ends. He wanted everything kind of tied up and neatly finished off like a perfect equation, and to his mind, you had to go right back to the beginning and explain the origin of everything. How did it arise? What caused everything? So the basic question in origins is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why can't you just have an endless regress? Well, for Leibniz's mind, an endless regress was a kind of lazy, loose end. It didn't come to a final conclusion. It would be a bit like saying, if I have a book here, this book is a copy of this book, which is a copy of this book, which is a copy of this book, which is a copy of this book that was copied from this book, that was copied from this book. You get the point, copied from this book. And if you say, but where is this book copied from? You could just say, well, it's lost in the mist of time. It just goes back endlessly. Well, no, you would have an originator of an idea, like you might have an Archimedes who jumps out of the bath with his displacement theory and he thinks of a new idea, and then he goes about writing a book about that, or somebody does, and then his ideas are passed on to somebody else. So there would have to be a final explanation. And this hunch that people have that there's a universe here, it requires some explanation. Everything else in our experience that is in effect has a cause, and therefore it seems reasonable to assume that the universe has a cause. So he's essentially saying that the chain of causes and effects has to have a beginning. If you just say, well, this is caused by this, is caused by this, and the domino chain goes back endlessly, then you're effectively saying that there's an infinite regress, and for Leibniz's mind, that is a loose end. Incidentally, Leibniz came from Hanover, and Hanover makes Choco-Leibniz biscuits, which are in the name of Leibniz's greatest son, the city's greatest son. So if we were doing this in class, I would obviously be offering Leibniz chocolate biscuits as an incentive for excellent homework to everybody here. So maybe after this whole coronavirus thing's come and gone and we're back to school, whenever you can come and claim your Leibniz chocolate biscuit for doing an excellent essay here or response to these questions. If nothing is caused, the chain, but if nothing caused the chain, there would be no chain at all. So Aristotle, upon whom all the kind of philosophers of the cosmological argument are dependent, because Aristotle has this idea of the prime mover, the kind of final cause behind everything. Aristotle believes that nothing comes from nothing. So if you've got something, it's not just popped into existence randomly. It has an origin, it has a source, a cause, and that's what the intuition that this argument's working off. As human beings, we have a strong intuition that effects, objects, people, buildings have causes. The cosmos, our 13.8 billion year old universe with around 100 billion stars in our galaxy and 200 billion galaxies, and the 200 billion stars in our galaxy, sorry, it's between 100 and 200 billion galaxies and 200 billion stars. and 2,500 stars with planets around them, exoplanets I think they're called, they require an explanation. If there's something, it didn't just pop into existence, it has to have an origin. So this intuition suggests from Aristotle onwards. So the cosmological argument is essentially saying you don't get a free lunch in the universe. If something's here, it must have an origin. And this was kind of argued out in a debate between two philosophers on in the radio in about, I think, the 1960s. There was Bertrand Russell, who's an atheist, and there was Frederick Copleston, who was a Catholic priest and a philosopher, and they argue about this. And here's a little extract from their discussion. You can listen to it on YouTube, incidentally. But when is an explanation adequate? So Russell had said, I should say that the universe is just there, and that's all. He's very posh, so he would speak like that. But when is an explanation adequate? Suppose I'm about to make a flame with a match. You may say that the adequate explanation of that is that I rub it on the box. An adequate explanation must ultimately be a total explanation to which nothing further can be added. This is Leibniz's idea that you come to the end of the chain of cause and effect, and there is a self-caused cause, a self-existent cause that doesn't itself have a cause. That's a necessary cause. Russell, then I could say that you're looking for an explanation that can't be got and which one ought not to expect. To say that one has not found it is one thing. To say that one should not look for it seems to me to be dogmatic. Copleston felt that Russell's refusal to answer the question of why there was something rather than nothing, because that might require God as an explanation, Russell didn't want to go there, was like refusing to sit down at the chessboard and play because you might be beaten. That was Frederick Copleston's response in the debate. So the first thing you need to say here is, which side of this debate do you think you find yourself on? Are you acceptant of the idea that the universe is just a brute fact, that we may never be able to get an exhaustive explanation of the origins of the universe? We're working on that. I mean, you will have heard of the CERN laboratory in Switzerland and of study of subatomic particles with this huge particle accelerator of something like 27 kilometers that recreates some of the conditions of physics at the very origin of the universe. And so we're looking at the last milliseconds after the Big Bang, but to kind of get right back there is more in the realm of theoretical physics. So science may not ever be able to yield an exhaustive account of the origins of the universe. To do that, you may need to speculate or go beyond science to metaphysics to kind of look at other universes or oscillating universes, which is more in the realm of theoretical than experimental physics. But what do you think? Do you think that the universe has to have a final cause that is exhaustive and explains everything, or do you think it could have an infinite regress? That's the first question. The second question, if you look at the video above that's there, look at the premises. This video explains these premises, but take any one of them and challenge it. So here are the premises. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Now, we might challenge that by saying there are subatomic particles that seem to pop into existence, like quarks or gluons or bosons, that don't they don't follow normal causation in physics. So maybe they are exceptions to the rule. Number two, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Now, this seems to be a logical leap. Could we say there could be a physical explanation that is available to science but hasn't necessarily been exhaustively proven experimentally yet? We're kind of pushing here to say, the theist is at least, if there is an exhaustive explanation, it can only come from God. But maybe Stephen Hawking's singularity, which is saying that the whole matter of the universe in a sense shrinks down to this infinitesimally compact and hot and intense singularity, would that be an explanation of the universe? Some people have speculated about quantum vacuum fluctuations that cause the origin of the universe. Could we have an origin story that doesn't entail God, that is purely physical laws that don't have any kind of end in sight? The universe exists. Well, I don't think that's the premise to deny. And the explanation of the universe is existence is God. That's the conclusion. So premise 1 or 2, pick one of those and look to challenge the argument. Third task is on logic. The logic of the causal cosmological argument is airtight. If the first 3 premises are true, the conclusion is unavoidable. What's the name in logic? I'll give you a clue. It's either inductive or deductive. Leibniz distinguishes 2 types of causes: contingent causes and necessary causes. Put A or B, after 1 or 2 above to show which one it is. So A, causes which exist by their own nature and it's impossible for them not to exist. Okay, so cannot not exist are self-caused causes. Or objects or events which are caused to exist by something else that preceded them. Right, so if you remember Michael J. Fox in the film Back to the Future, he has to, when he time travels, go back to get his mom and dad to meet. Otherwise, he and his siblings are kind of melting or airbrushed away from the photos of the family. So they're contingent, dependent upon the prior cause of their parents getting together. Now, we're looking here at 2 fallacies that are often associated with this argument. The first is the fallacy of composition, and it's put forward by David Hume. And David Hume says a number of critical points about the cosmological argument. The first is that we often assume that what's true of the parts is true of the whole, right? That's the fallacy of composition. We say that, you know, all of the constituent parts are of this nature, therefore the whole is of this nature. It would be like saying every chicken comes from an egg, therefore chickenness must come from one giant egg, or everyone in the world, this is Bertrand Russell's example, everyone in the world has a mother, therefore the world must have a mother, right? So saying everything in the universe has a cause, therefore the universe must have a cause, could be an example of the fallacy of composition. The second fallacy is the taxicab fallacy, right? So when you're in a taxicab, you kind of get in, you pay your fee, and the driver drives off. Now, you don't just suddenly, when the car's in motion, open the door and step out. That would be very dangerous, okay? But the taxicab fallacy is kind of saying that it's the assumption that you can kind of get out whenever you like. So I suppose in a car, you're in or let's say in a bus or a train, you can't just get out whenever you like. So imagine you're getting a train to London, and in the middle of the rural countryside, you tell the driver you want to get out, and the driver says, well, it doesn't work like that, you have to wait till the stations. And you say, well, it works like that for a taxi cab, why doesn't it work like that for a train? That's what this fallacy is talking about. So in science, once you're committed to science, you've got to follow it all the way through. You can't just kind of let go of science. So if you're committed to finding scientific explanations, you can't just then say, well, we can't give an explanation of the origins of things, and therefore there isn't an explanation, and we shouldn't look for one, because that's getting out of the taxicab of science. It's saying everything in our scientific mindset and study leads us to pursue causes and effects and to study them. And when we come to the origins of the universe, we ought to be consistent and stick with that. So that's a criticism that Arthur Schopenhauer brings forward, the taxicab fallacy, that you can look for explanations of things. You know, this is caused by this, is caused by this, is caused by this. But when it comes to the origin of the universe, you just say, and it's lost in the mist of time. That's like getting out of the taxicab at that time. And it's not like a taxicab. It's like science is like a train. You've got to go and follow it all the way. So you have to, in these, explain briefly what is meant by the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of the taxicab. Now, then you've got to watch this crash course video, which is talking about Aquinas and Aquinas's cosmological arguments. There are 3 of his 5 ways that are about this, and he's a 13th century monk, perhaps the greatest philosopher of the medieval period. And what he does is put forward 3 arguments: the argument from motion, the argument from causation, and the argument from necessity. And these are the 3 forms of the causal argument for Aquinas. So the first form is, you've got to, in your own words, complete this statement. The argument from motion: Aquinas, who trusted Aristotle's belief that the natural state of any object was rest, thought that if things were in motion, then. Now, Aristotle had this weird idea that the natural state of things is rest. So I've got a random object to plug here, and if I let go of that, then a force must have acted upon it, because the natural state of objects is rest, and therefore if they're in motion, then a force is acting upon it, gravity, or we throw it. So the propulsion would be the force. So the argument from motion is that if things are in motion, and they are in the world, we can observe them all the time, birds are flying, the planets are moving, then something must have caused that, because their natural state is rest. Now that doesn't make much sense to us, but it did to the 13th century monk Aquinas. The second argument is the argument from causation. Some things are caused. Anything that's caused has to be caused by something else. There can't be an infinite regress. There must have been a first cause. This cause we call God. Okay, so that's the idea of an infinite regress being unrealistic. So in your own words, there can't, in Aquinas' mind, be an infinite regress of causes, because if this were so, then. And the third argument Aquinas uses is the argument from contingency. There are essentially 2 classes of being: those which are dependent upon some prior cause. Okay, so I couldn't put this plug up here and say, well, this is self-caused. This is a unique plug in the world. It has no origin. It just has been here since the origin of time and before. It's an eternal plug. You would say nonsense. It's got, manufactured in China. It has an origin. We could probably go to the factory that produced it, and it's got an explanation for why it's in existence. That is a contingent cause. And a necessary cause is a cause that has always existed, that always will exist, that cannot not exist, that is self-caused. And God is a necessary being. Now, the argument here is that there are contingent things, okay, things like you and me, which had a beginning and were dependent upon things prior to them, and that we can't go back for an explanation on contingent things. Contingent things are caused by contingent things. If this book is copied from this book, which is copied from this book, then they're all contingent things. They needn't have been there if the author hadn't written them. Then ultimately, you must at least have one necessary thing to have an explanation. So in your own words, you've got to explain this and say why it rules out the infinite regress. And then task 6, there's only 7, 3 common objections. You've got to explain these. So there are 4 objections here, rather. Pick one of the above and say why you think it's the strongest objection. I'll just go through these. Number 1, Aquinas' argument that may establish that God, who's is the first cause, but it doesn't go so far as to say that God is personal. Now, Aquinas is a Catholic monk, and he doesn't want to just end up with an impersonal God, may the force be with you, some kind of vague being. He wants to end up with a personal God that you pray to, that you worship, who does miracles, who kind of reveals himself in holy texts and so on. The problem with this argument is, at its best, all it establishes is that there's some powerful force behind things. Aristotle didn't believe in a personal God. The argument doesn't commit you to that. So that's a problem. If you're a theist, it doesn't get you the whole 9 yards. It just gets you up to believing that there's a God, not that that God is worthy of worship or personal, and that he has any loving interest in the world, or even that he's benevolent. The God may be malevolent or, disinterested in the world. Number two, why can't there be an infinite regress? Right? There could just be oscillating universes that are transferring energy endlessly, or there could be multiverses. That's not an explanation or a conclusion we could rule out. Leibniz didn't like it because he wanted, as a mathematician, the problem solved exhaustively, but maybe we have to be content with that. Objection three, if everything has a cause, why does God get to be an exception? Now, the answer to this is obviously, from Aquinas' point of view, God is a different class of being. He's a necessary being, not a contingent being. But we might not accept that. We might want to say God ought to be subject to this rule as well. The argument is often put in the form, the Kalam cosmological argument, everything that begins to exist must have a cause. And so, of course, if God doesn't begin to exist, then he doesn't need a cause. That would be one response to that objection. And the final objection is a very interesting one by David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher from Edinburgh. He says he liked playing billiards, Hume did, and he was very interested. I don't know if you've ever played snooker or pool, very similar to billiards. When you hit the cue ball onto the other balls, you can kind of look at cause and effect. You can look at how one ball moves, and if you hit it on the left or the right side, or you'll spin the cue in a certain way, you play the cue high or low on the ball, you think you've got control over things. And what Hume kind of wants us to note is we don't know what we're talking about when we talk about causes. We're very prone to seeing correlations, two things side by side happening all the time, like I put my left boot on before my right boot, and every time I've done that, we win the football match. Therefore, if I put my left boot on before my right boot, we will win the next football match. We're very superstitious and prone to doing things like that. And Hume says, we really don't know what we're talking about with causes. What we're observing is past experience. What we can't be sure about is that this will determine future experience. So when we come to universes, we're out of our depth. We've not seen a universe begin. We've seen people build houses, but we haven't seen people build universes. So we can't really talk with confidence about the origin of the universe and causation with any certainty. So pick the strongest objection there and say why it's the strongest, pick the weakest and say why it's the weakest. And finally, a quote by Dawkins here, who says, the cosmological arguments rely upon the idea of an infinite regress and invoke God to terminate it. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. Even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one, there is absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thoughts. So he's picking up a number of the criticisms we've already mentioned. Put Dawkins' criticism in your own words, and you must use these phrases in doing so. If you finish that, then watch this video. Now, I think that's 2 lessons worth of work, and I'm going to give you both Wednesday and Thursday to do that. I'll be online in those lessons, so if you have any questions, do ask. We could even set up an audio chat there if people feel they want to talk through a particular question, but otherwise just get on with the tasks there. Feel free to email them through and obviously hand them in, and I'll mark them and get them back to you in due course.